All right, greetings everybody, and welcome to my continued series in Canadian history. This lecture should generally, probably generally, follow the lecture, the two-part lecture on Canada in the Second World War, as this will kind of pick up right at the end of that. Some of you may have watched sort of post-war Canada and the world. I've got a two-part lecture on that period dealing with Canada and the world from 45 to 68, and then part two is 68 to 2000. So I guess really theoretically you could watch them in any order, as long as you watch the Second World War II first. This lecture will deal strictly with Canada on the home front, so we're not going to be talking so much about foreign affairs or diplomacy and things like that. What we are going to be doing is looking at how Canada sort of came into its own, if you will, after the end of the Second World War. We had gone through a dramatic period of prosperity, the post-war boom as they call it, very similar to what happened in the United States as well. So there's a lot of commonalities, and part of this continuing development in Canada is also trying to move forward with a certain degree of autonomy in our identity. We had continued throughout the 50s and 60s to try to carve out an appreciation for our national culture, our national heritage when it comes to contributions in music, in the arts and sports, but we're always sort of struggling with that tremendous influence coming out of the United States, which was almost unavoidable. Much of what we inherit from the United States in terms of our cultural experience, many would argue were relatively positive, whether it be the nature of how consumer goods developed, whether it be how youth culture developed, television, the birth and rise of rock and roll music, all these things oftentimes originated in the States, but really sort of permeate into the Canadian landscape, and of course into much of Western Europe at the time as well. So those are the kind of things we're going to be looking at over the course of this lecture. So let's move on. All right, so after the Second World War, nearly 1 million Canadians returned home from Europe, some with wives they married there. 48,000 war brides arrived with their children in Canada between 1945 and 46. That is a pretty remarkable number. 48,000 women, predominantly English, although there were of course French brides, there were even some German brides, many that came with their Canadian husbands back to Canada. So the war brides had to adjust to the sheer size and climate of the country, but all Canadians, new and old, embraced a booming economy, thousands of immigrants, new suburbs, more vehicles or cars, televisions and portable radios, all a sign of a new society driven by materialism. You know, one of the things we have to consider, why was there a boom in the 1920s after the Great War, and why was there a boom in the 1950s after the Second World War? The best way to sort of explain this phenomenon is the idea that we have to consider that when Canada was on a war footing in the First and Second World War, we'll refer to the Second in our case because that's the one we're talking about specifically, that we had developed a system of industries that were pumping out war products, you know, that were helping with the war effort. And what happens is, instead of dismantling those manufacturing jobs, or those factories for that matter, we just converted from a war economy, that is these factories making war supplies, to a consumer society where now these factories are making consumer goods. So as you begin to flood the market with televisions are the big one, because by 1949 televisions are becoming a fairly significant part of the entertainment landscape, if you will, in Canada. The more people that have a television, the more that people want it as well. So certainly by the middle 1950s, it's commonplace for the majority of Canadian families to have a television. So consumerism driven by advertisement, driven also by this idea of materialism, the desire for more stuff, right? And the thing is that there was no lack of money around, there was no lack of jobs in the post-war economy, everybody was doing fairly well. And certainly that World War II generation, after that horrible experience, really just wanted to come home. 48,000 who brought their war brides, men who came home single, usually married their sweethearts they had before they went to war, or they found new relationships. And really, I think for that generation, settling into a comfortable living, a comfortable home, having children, being married, just kind of reintegrating themselves into a level of normalcy was a huge, huge desire for many of these Canadian soldiers, most of whom, I'm sure, were suffering from some level of PTSD. You know, the remarkable thing with the World War I and the World War II generation is these guys saw and did and had to be part of pretty horrible things, whether it be battles, whether it be all kinds of things, seeing death, contributing to death, whatever it may be. There was stuff that these men had to deal with, but they came back. There was really no understanding of helping these men from a mental health perspective. Many of them just quietly were dealing with their trauma, but the fact that the economy was doing well, the fact that they were settling into new jobs and raising children, obviously was a very pleasant distraction from the horrors of the war. But you know, that generation was a pretty remarkable bunch because of what they endured and how they were able just to come back and quietly, you know, get back to living a normal life. You know, there's so many, you know, the refrain is often told that, you know, my grandfather, or in some cases my great-grandfather, never talked about the war. And this was not uncommon. In some cases, many of these men went to their grave not talking in a great deal about the war. Some, as they got older, began to share these stories, but for the most part, that generation was tough as nails, and you know, they came back and contributed to the continuing development of the Canadian economy. Veterans were given privileges like guarantees of their old jobs, shouldn't be surprising, hiring preferences in government jobs, free tuition and living allowances at colleges and universities, and the Veterans Land Act was passed, enabling veterans to obtain mortgages at preferential rates. So this was the Canadian government's recognition for their service. It was a way, certainly a way of saying thank you. It was also a way of saying we are going to make sure that your reintroduction into civilian life is going to be as smooth as possible. So, all right. So, people uprooted by the war in Europe included concentration camp survivors and those who fled war zones. They had no homes, possessions, or hope, and the UN deemed these people displaced persons. There were hundreds of thousands of displaced persons. I mean, I think about all the Poles who had endured a brutal Nazi occupation. The Polish Jews, I believe 3 million of the 6 million who died, or at least close to it, were Polish Jews. I mean, at the end of the war, when the Nazis are defeated, there are people, you know, who are either finally leaving camps. There are people who are basically looking for a place to sleep because their homes had been bombed. I mean, there were hundreds of thousands of displaced people, not only in the areas occupied by the Nazis, but also by German civilians as well, because in order to end this war, Germany literally had to be carpet bombed. So there were millions of displaced people in Germany as well. So it was a real mess after this. Between 1945 and 1967, 2.5 million newcomers arrived to Canada, and many who could not speak English or French had a difficult adjustment. You know, once again, this is another example of Canada's contribution in that, in having an open door policy of welcoming people who are leaving their homelands, probably not only with the destruction they had seen and endured, but the mental health challenges they faced by what they witnessed. Who knows what happened to their families, who knows what they saw. And I think for many of these displaced people, understandably, they really just wanted to start a new life, and here was Canada willing to welcome them in. So, unlike pre-World War I refugees who largely settled on the prairies, many of these new immigrants settled in the cities of central Canada. Their cultures, viewpoints, hard work, and foods enriched Canada in many ways. You know, you think about that generation that came between sort of 1890 to 1914, a lot of them were sort of Eastern European. The Ukrainians, of course, were a significant number. The majority of people that came to Canada in that last best west phase of our history usually were people that had strong farming backgrounds, that were fleeing starvation and difficulty at home, who came with that wisdom and with those abilities, came to the Canadian prairies and built a remarkable life for themselves there. Many of the displaced peoples who came to Canada were not necessarily agricultural people. A lot of them were city dwellers that had, municipal jobs or worked for the government or, had, or were teachers or lawyers and so forth. So there are a lot of people coming from all parts of Europe looking for new opportunities in Canada. So older areas of the city were vacated by veterans and their families who moved to the new suburbs, where these new communities had their parks, schools, places of worship. Okay, there's a picture of a suburb. The idea of a suburb really is, and here's some people, of course, displaced persons after the war. But coming back to the suburb, the idea of a suburb was relatively a new phenomenon, because what happens is, if you've got a city, we'll call it a circle, right? You got the city center, that's where the town hall is, that's where the major shopping is, that's where the factories are. And as communities grow, they grow outside the city, right? Where there's room, because obviously inside the circle, there's people, and there's businesses, and there's homes. The new suburbs are built on the outskirts of the center part of the city where there's more land to expand. So what we see happening in Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, Regina, Victoria, Vancouver, you name it, is this growth outward. And out of these outward areas develop these new suburbs. The old cliche about the suburbs of the 1940s and 50s is that, these perfect little boxes, row upon row upon row upon row of houses that look exactly the same, all the streets look the same, everybody's got a white picket fence. There is a sort of element of conformity, that everybody just wanted the new normal. And I don't think people were necessarily complaining about the fact that their house looked exactly like their neighbors. They were probably just very happy to be in, at that time, what would have been a new home, maybe with some of the new advantages that the consumer atmosphere could contribute to their homes, whether it be refrigerators or televisions and so forth. So a lot of these new families and displaced persons are coming and living in these new suburbs. And the other part that's unique about the suburb is the idea that within the community of your suburb, you've got your suburb school, your suburb later the mall, your suburb parks, churches, schools, hospitals, and within each city, you have all these boroughs, these suburb mini communities. When I think about, for example, where I live, Victoria, BC, we've got Langford and Colwood, and we've got Machosen, Oak Bay, Esquimalt, Saanich, and so on and so on. These are all sort of mini communities within Greater Victoria. The same as in any city, whether you're talking Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and so on and so forth. They all have their suburbs, and it's really the post-World War II period where we see these things develop. The new suburbs brought along a new set of values centered on the traditional family with the stay-at-home mother at its heart. There was sort of this sort of desire to as I say, and to often use cliches, women stayed at home, they had children, they prepared supper, they kept the house in order, dad worked full time, and in those days, it was possible for a family, for the father to be the primary breadwinner. And if mom could stay home and look after the kids and look after the home, and the father made enough of an income to make that happen, then that was seen as relatively preferential. Nobody was really arguing about that, and those are really the golden days, because in today's climate, it's nearly impossible for a single for there to be one breadwinner in the home. It is now pretty well mandatory if you want to maintain your mortgage in today's climate. Mom and dad both need to work, and in my case, my wife and I were both teachers, and we both have to work in order to make ends meet. So a lot of opportunities at this time, but there was a real sort of traditional value when it came to how the family was going to live. Women, who made up 1/3 of the workforce, had to give up their jobs to returning veterans, and remember that during the war those women filled those positions in order to keep industry going while men went off to war. Traditional femininity was emphasized, and new gadgets like vacuums, TVs, toasters, food processors made housework less like drudgery. I often say to students now, we're just so used to the conveniences. Young people today would never think, God, can you remember a day? Can you imagine a time before the television? Can you imagine the time before the internet, before the vacuum cleaner, before the dishwasher, whatever it may be? Certainly there was a time when people had to hand wash everything, or drag their carpets outside and beat them with a stick, or churn their own butter, whatever it may be. That these consumer goods that were really coming out of this age of consumerism were making life a lot easier for people, particularly for housewives who now had modern gadgets to make housework a little less brutal. Husbands and fathers were expected to be the breadwinners, supporting the family and the new suburban life on one salary. And that was possible, Let me give you a quick example, and I think this is relevant to this. The house I live in right now was the house that my family bought in 1971. And just to give you an example, when this house was bought, when my family home was bought in 1971, it cost my father, I think he paid $28,000 for this home, and I believe that his salary as a university professor was roughly half to 2/3 that. I don't know the exact figure, but let's say he made $20,000 a year in 1971 as a university professor. It was somewhere around there. So he made 2/3 the income of the value of his home. The very house that was purchased for $28,000 in 1971 now is worth upwards of $900,000, which is not uncommon for what we call a standard 1960s, 1970s box type home. Now if I made 2/3 the salary of my home right now, I'd be making $600,000 a year. That is not the case. The point of this analogy is to draw to your attention the idea that my dad in 1971 as a teacher made ample money to pay the mortgage, go on regular trips, pay for all our clothing and food and everything, and my mom could stay home and look after 4 kids. There was no issue or concerns about money. But inflation, of course, has changed that. So that generation, the World War II generation, or the post-World War II generation, financially had it much better than this generation. I mean, you think of young families now, 2 young families just starting out, to buy a new home, a standard 5-bedroom home for $800,000 to $900,000 is just almost unthinkable, the kind of mortgage you would carry at that time. So it's quite remarkable when you think about how different financially our lives are than they were 40, 50 years ago even. So between 1946 and 1961, 6.7 million babies were born in Canada. Holy mackerel. The massive growth in families and birth resulted in a period known as the baby boom. The baby boomers were people that were born directly after the war. It is the largest demographic of people we've ever seen in the Western world. And now these baby boomers, the older ones, are in their mid-70s now. And many people say that, oh my gosh, if our medical system can withstand the baby boomers in the next 10, 20 years, then we're going to be home free. Because this is going to put the greatest amount of stress on our medical system. But if we get through it, which I'm sure we will, then we can we can endure anything. So huge generation, 6.7 million babies in Canada. You know, a lot of this, again, comes back to the idea of these soldiers coming back and really just wanting to forget about the war, live their lives, have a family, go on vacations, build a little white picket fence, and live a perfect little life. You know, the age of conformity, the stereotypes of the 1950s that we have, largely through television, old television shows like Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver, those kind of things, really sort of exemplify, while they are stereotypes, that sort of notion of the perfect family and the perfect neighborhood with well-mannered children and perfectly placed parents. You know, dad works full-time, mom's got an apron on in the kitchen and making bread, and the kids are happy and everybody's just doing their part. It's an over sort of used cliche, but at the same time there was an element of truth to that there was this sort of conformist attitude, and a lot of that was built around this desire to live a normal life, and fortunately the economy was doing well enough that people could do that. So it's an interesting combination of things in the 1950s. This generation is the largest age group in Canada, and its influence has been felt throughout our culture and economy, especially manufacturing of new products to meet this massive demand. So, all right, let's look at consumerism of the 1950s. Here we have a family watching television, which became all the rage. The one and only Elvis Presley. Films about rock and roll, Rock Around the Clock with Bill Haley and the Comets, rather. And then down below, one of the most remarkable performers of Canadian musical history, a group called The Band, formed in they started playing together in 1960, but they became The Band in 1968. They played with Bob Dylan in the middle 1960s, and you know, there's a real sort of mystical sort of history that's tied in with The Band. 4 of the 5 members were Canadian, 1 was from Arkansas. So. All right, dramatic increase in automobile sales changed neighborhoods, of course. Corner grocers were replaced by the mall, where people could gather in one-stop shop for almost anything. The mall, which is kind of now, in the early 21st century, a little bit on the ropes, because so many people are now buying online. It's actually threatened the existence of the traditional mall. But in the 1950s, the malls were the place. That's where people went on the weekends. That's what young people did. They went to the soda shop at the mall, you know, and that's where they met their friends. And so it was very much sort of the mall becomes like the social epicenter of your local suburb. So cars were large, consumed huge amounts of gas, and in the 1950s did not include seat belts. You know, it's a funny little anecdote, really, that I mention this. Because of course in today's culture, if we're not wearing our seatbelt, and we're going to get a ticket, and you know, we're always very, very, very regimented about, you know, when our kids get in the car, get your seatbelt on. If you've got an infant, it's got to be in the chair, it's got to be turned the right way, everything's got to be buckled up, and holy mackerel, you know. But even when I was young, growing up in the 70s, I don't ever recall wearing a seatbelt. We just bounced around in the car, and we'd be fighting and wrestling in the back seat, driving our parents crazy. But you know, there wasn't near the concern. And in the 50s, cars weren't even built with seatbelts in them. So very different times. In addition, drinking and driving was common as people went to cocktail parties. You know, this is another thing I find remarkable, how much we have changed. That, you know, the culture of drinking and driving was commonplace. You went to a party, nobody ever said, well, honey, I've had too much to drink, I better call a cab. People would drive home, and as irresponsible as that is in a 21st century mentality, it was quite commonplace at the time. If a policeman pulled you over, he might just say, look, you got to drive slow or I'll follow you home, which happened quite a bit, just to make sure you get home safely. And you might get a bit of a slap on the hand. But today, you know, drinking and driving, of course, today is absolutely taboo. It is dead against the law, and even, well, texting and driving is a major problem. That's now sort of the modern problem where drinking and driving may have been in previous generations, texting and driving is become a real problem today. So, the birth of television further pushed along consumerism, where ads for anything from cereal to Barbie dolls enticed children. Think about that. The impact of television cannot be understated. Oh my gosh. Because now, when your children are watching cartoons on Saturday morning, they're watching advertisements for Barbie dolls, for, you know, toy cars, for whatever it might be. Even as a kid, when I grew up in the early 70s, I remember being just as enamored with TV advertisements as I was the program itself, especially on a Saturday morning, because while I was watching shows like Land of the Lost or even Gilligan's Island or the Brady Bunch, they would always have an advertisement for some sort of cool Mattel hot rod car that, of course, I'd insist my mother buy for me at the next possible moment. So, I mean, I very much was a byproduct of that age where television advertisements really drove what I thought was my desire and demand for certain products, you know. So, interesting. Economic stability and consumerism created a new teen culture who created their own fashions from adults, and of course the coalescence or the combination of rock and roll and youth culture. What an incredible marriage. Especially the older baby boomers who are now teenagers by the late 50s, you know, had there are just a lot of kids. And when rock and roll came out on the scene and I think it really kind of starts with Elvis in 1954, I believe, with That's All Right Mama. And of course it just spins from there, and from Elvis we get Jerry Lee Lewis, the great piano player, singer, Fats Domino, of course, Little Richard, who very recently passed away, Buddy Holly, the Everly Brothers, the list goes on, and just such great music. When I listen to that music and watch them perform in old black and white film, I can only imagine how I would have reacted as a young person listening to that music too. So rock and roll is born it came at the perfect time. And one of the great things, there's so many wonderful, remarkable things about the birth of rock and roll, but I think one of the most important pieces about the birth of rock and roll is the idea that when you as a young person were watching television and you saw Chuck Berry, who I failed to mention before, or Little Richard or Fats Domino, who were African American artists, perform, you were just as giddy about them as you were about Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis Presley, who were white. What rock and roll does is it crosses the color line. Young people, sure, racism, of course, was still there, and certainly in the United States it was far more, had deep, ugly roots in that country that go back to slavery. But for young people, you know, they love to listen to Johnny B. Good by Chuck Berry, or Ain't That a Shame by Fats Domino, or Good Golly Miss Molly by Little Richard. These are some of the greatest rock and roll songs ever written by African American artists. So in many ways I think a lot of young people got past racism, maybe not entirely, but partially, by their love of rock and roll, you know. And I think in many ways that's why parents were so aghast with rock and roll, because it was, oh my gosh, these young African American or African Canadian kids and white kids are getting together and going to these concerts. Yeah, where it should have been seen as a good thing at the time, but in the 1950s there was still discomfort with that kind of thing. So there was a relative apprehension of parents to embrace. Plus you got to consider that rock and roll was very edgy. It was very sexual. It was very, very new. And I think, you know, the parents of the baby boomers had a bit of a hard time adjusting to it. So it's a very interesting story, the development of rock and roll. And as we said earlier, in the 50s, Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis dominated the charts. And in the 1960s, Canada would produce our own Neil Sedaka, I believe. I think he was Canadian. Yes, I believe he was. But later in the middle to late 60s, Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, the great Leonard Cohen. The band, this is a group I was talking about before. and of course the Guess Who. So if you haven't heard any of these bands before, particularly my students, I'd strongly, and Gordon Lightfoot, I didn't mention him, he's another, and there's so many others, but these are kind of the main ones. I would strongly suggest, uploading, top songs of these artists onto your phones, which you can do now through Spotify and Amazon Music and other streaming services. Streaming services are wonderful because they give you that opportunity to experiment with music, and you can upload it on your phone, listen to it. If you don't like it, you delete it and you put something else on there. So you do yourself a service and have a listen to some of the great Canadian music of the 1960s and 70s. All right. Well, like the 1920s, there was a sort of awareness in Canada that we've got to kind of somehow protect Canadian culture, because I think it was pretty clear that young Canadians were eating cheeseburgers and drinking Coca-Cola and going to movies, Hollywood movies on the weekend, and listening to rock and roll. These were all American forms of entertainment. And there was this sort of desire of not banning American culture or consumer goods or music or whatever. It was more trying to encourage or prop up Canadian artists to get exposure in the Canadian landscape so that Canadians can learn to appreciate Canadian arts as well. Most Canadians were influenced by American music and film, so in 1949 the federal government created the Massey Commission to investigate the state of Canadian culture. In 1957, the Canadian Council gave grants to writers, artists, and theatres, resulting in the Royal Winnipeg Ballet, once again a desire to encourage the arts in Canada. In literature, authors like Robertson Davies, Margaret Lawrence, W.O. Mitchell, and Alice Munro, there she is up here, would become very popular. 1952, the CBC expanded into television with a focus on cultural education, but this did not stop Canadians from preferring U.S. television, of course. Lassie, I Love Lucy, Leave It to Beaver, and it was the U.S. TV that exposed Canadians to Elvis Presley and the Beatles on the popular Ed Sullivan Show. It was, through American networks that we got exposure to all that great American music. I don't even know if there were really very successful Canadian sitcoms in the 1950s. We had variety type shows on the CBC, but I don't think we had, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure we didn't have something that was really popular. We do later in the 70s have shows that become quite popular in Canada that are Canadian made, but at the time I think the majority of what Canadians watched in the 1950s were American shows. In 1968, the federal government created the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunication Commission. Holy mackerel, that's a big one. CRTC, to regulate foreign material and impose rules requiring Canadian content. All right, so there's that desire. All right, well, more of the boom of the time. It was agreed in the federal government, still led by Mackenzie King, that private companies would handle the transition to a peacetime economy with help from government incentives. Crown corporations would be auctioned off to private companies. Crown corporations were generally government-owned companies. They'd be auctioned off to private companies at low prices in order to produce consumer demands like washing machines, cars, etc. Federal taxation of Canadians would ensure that through equalization payments, poor provinces would receive federal support. So equalization payments was a system developed to ensure that each province, regardless of how wealthy or poor they were, could offer a similar level of services, particularly in the medical field and also in education and in infrastructure as well. Vast Canadian resources like Alberta oil would fuel the economy, but manufacturing centered in Ontario, which could create resentments in other provinces. Despite this, massive programs like the Trans-Canada Highway, here's a picture of it here, was completed in 1970, and the St. Lawrence Seaway completed in 1959. Oh no, sorry, that's the St. Lawrence Seaway, my mistake. I'm looking at it from an angle. This is just a picture from the sign from the Trans-Canada Highway. The combination of the completion of the Trans-Canada Highway in 1970 and the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway was huge. Because now people, if you wanted to, you could drive from Vancouver to Toronto. Or you could even go as far as Nova Scotia. You still would have to take a boat to Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland, but for the most part you could get the majority of the way clear across the country on this highway. And the St. Lawrence Seaway could bring shipping through the Great Lakes and so on and so forth. So, huge, huge advantages. Despite the prosperity, the working poor, who were mostly immigrants, suffered as mothers were forced to work. Ironically, they were frowned upon by society. This is interesting. So, poor families were usually forced to have the mom and dad both working, and that was kind of seen as, oh my gosh, how come mom's working? Mom shouldn't be working. She should be staying home, raising the kids. Well, some people didn't have a choice. You know, if it was a question of making ends meet, that is paying the bills and paying your mortgage, then that's what you had. You had to do what you had to do. So, all right, a lot of colorful characters in politics. 1949, Newfoundland would vote to join Canada. Newfoundland was not part of Canada until 1949. I mean, they were still, technically, I guess they were still a British colony, or an extension of Great Britain until then. So when Newfoundlanders fought in World War I and World War II, they didn't fight as Canadians yet. If you were in the Korean War, though, they would have, right? If there were Newfoundlanders in the Korean War, they would fight as Canadians, not as Newfoundlanders. Television became a focal point of communication by the mid-50s, and Louis Saint Laurent, who replaced Mackenzie King in 1948 upon retirement, would appear old and tired by 1957, and the more dynamic conservative leader, John Diefenbaker, here he is. His clashes with John F. Kennedy were quite remarkable. I talk about that in great length in our lecture on Canada and the World, 1945 to 68. This is Lester B. Pearson. You know, the problem with Louis Saint Laurent is that, you know, I'm sure he was very capable. He'd been in politics for years. The problem with Louis Saint Laurent was that he just didn't have a really good presentation style. And you have to consider that now Canadians can look at their leaders and judge their leaders not only by listening to them on the radio, but now by watching them on television. So there's an aesthetic appeal that you need to kind of have in order to be popular. You needed to be charismatic. You needed to be well spoken. Probably would benefit from having a certain degree of a sense of humor, maybe self-deprecating humor, you know, which could be endearing depending on how you look at it. But so I think in many ways the impact of television really begins to shape the presentation of a politician, that the presentation is very important. Deef, as he was called, was used to public speaking as a lawyer, and he proved to be a witty orator, okay, and the first Prime Minister from the prairies. The defeated Liberals chose Pearson as their new leader, who was popular with younger and urban voters, especially in central Canada. Pearson, I believe, would replace Diefenbaker. I think it was 1963 or 64, somewhere, I think maybe even 1964. And I believe it was Lester Pearson who was Prime Minister when we got our new flag, which I think it was 1965, but you might check into that just because I'm going by memory from quite some time ago. So, John Diefenbaker, who came from neither British or French stock, became a fierce nationalist who supported the connection with Britain and opposed U.S. influence and interference in Canada. You know, John Diefenbaker was such a nationalist that at times he was blind that by cutting off our connection with the Americans was actually kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. That, you know, he kind of miscalculated the idea that, you know, we need to be completely independent and free from America. On one level, yes, of course we do, but not to the extent where we are hurting ourselves economically. And certainly his decisions during the Cuban Missile Crisis caused all kinds of problems with him and John F. Kennedy. But, you know, just things like that. So I think, you know, Diefenbaker, he kind of let that, his Canadian nationalism, get in the way of his pragmatism, if you will. So, Socialized Medicine would be born out of Saskatchewan by Tommy Douglas. And for those of you that like movies and television, he is the grandfather of Kiefer Sutherland. I believe Kiefer Sutherland's mother was Tommy Douglas's daughter. So, therefore, Donald Sutherland, the great Canadian actor, was not related because Kiefer Sutherland is connected to Tommy Douglas through his mother. Shirley Douglas, I think her name was, I'm not too sure, but yeah. So Kiefer Sutherland, the actor, his grandfather was the great Tommy Douglas, who believed no one should go broke when receiving medical services. In 1962, the bill was passed in Saskatchewan, and in the same year, Tommy Douglas became leader of the federal NDP, which was born out of the CCF, which we've talked about quite a bit in the past before. So Socialized Medicine is spearheaded by Tommy Douglas. You know, Tommy Douglas was a social democrat. You know, he was not a communist, he was not a socialist. He's someone who understood that it was a human right of every Canadian to have access to a medical system that was going to catch them anytime they fell. People should not have to pay through the teeth to have a child or to get a broken leg fixed. People should not feel inclined to avoid going to the doctor because they can't afford it. So that idea that is very much embedded in part of our Canadian experience, the absolute imperative role that the medical industry plays in Canadian lives. It's not perfect. You know, it's often changing and evolving, but for the most part, you know, it's one of the most remarkable stories of Canadian social history, the idea of having this socialized medicine for all Canadians. All right, by 1967, during Canada's centennial, that's when we turned 100, both Diefenbaker and Pearson seemed out of touch with young boomers. You know, by 1967, the majority of baby boomers were now in their late teens, early 20s. They were now voting. And because they were such a huge group of Canadians, they could very easily influence politics through their vote. And of course they do. Many look to a young Trudeau as the leader of a new era. There he is. Not Justin, but Pierre, his father. Pierre Trudeau, there he is here. You know, people just absolutely adored him. You know, he was perfectly placed. I mean, yes, he was a remarkable leader, but he was also a leader at a time when the baby boomers were beginning to vote. You have to consider the social climate at the time. A lot of young people were very influenced by the music of the 1960s, by even the anti-Vietnam protests, the civil rights movement in the US really trickled into Canada, where we began to really develop a sort of a social consciousness. And ironically, our First Peoples in Canada were still very much on the margin. But this is a period where people begin to say, hey, wait a second here, you know, we have people in our society that have been marginalized. Maybe we need to look at our own problems because Vietnam and civil rights is not a Canadian problem. This is an American problem. But what those movements do for Canadians is they kind of teach us to think about, you know, people on the margin in our society, I guess is the best way to put it. He drove a sports car to Parliament, dated the likes of Barbara Streisand, and had a sense of humor in a relaxed manner. He was definitely charming. Trudeaumania gripped the nation, and his policy of a just society believed that government had a moral duty to protect the rights and freedoms of people and to foster their social and economic well-being. By 1965, 1/2 of the population of North America was under 25, and the result was massive youth involvement in politics and civil disobedience. So there you have it. Hence, the mass social movements of the 1960s were driven by the baby boomers. Baby boomers, sorry. Try saying that over and over again, quickly. The sheer number of young people in North America and Europe created a more powerful youth culture of protest as well. So the transition began with the British invasion led by the Beatles, whose longer hair became very fashionable. Oh my gosh, I don't even have the Beatles up here. I've got The Who, I've got Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, and I'm going to assume this is probably a segment or a photo from the infamous 1969 concert at Woodstock. What happens in the 60s is just as revolutionary as what happens in the 1950s with rock and roll. What happens is these young British artists who were all influenced by the music of the 1950s and more importantly by American blues music, by the likes of people like Muddy Waters, Chester Burnett, who also is known as Howlin' Wolf, Willie Dixon, and of course harking back to the great Robert Johnson of the 1930s. It's ironic that young British kids in the early 60s were more influenced by that American blues music than white American kids at the time. And when the Beatles come along and the Rolling Stones and the Who and a whole bunch of artists, they were all harking back to the great blues music of African American blues, which of course was a big influence on rock and roll in general. So it's very interesting how that happened. The evolution of rock music reinforced this youth rebellion demonstrated by long hair, strange clothing, sexual promiscuity, drugs, and the birth of the hippies, or the counterculture as it was called. Young people rejected conformity and consumerism and embraced rebellion as seen in various social movements of the time. So, you know, the ethos, which means like the culture of the hippies, was very much built around the ideas, I don't want to live the life like my parents. I don't want to live in a perfect home with a white picket fence and mom making bread and dad reading a newspaper in the living room. I want to grow my hair long. I don't want to do what my dad did. I want to do something else. I want to go back to nature. I want to live on a commune. I want to go, you know, live in the mountains or whatever it may be. I want to... It's really interesting that when you think about a lot of the ideals of the hippies, you know, which was seen as way out there in the 1960s, really, many of the hippies, if you think about what's important to our culture now, environmentalism was really spearheaded by the age of the hippies. Organic foods and healthy eating, you know, the old term referring to hippies as nuts and berries, which is silly, but you know, there was a real movement to kind of get back to nature, tilling your own land, growing your own food, not polluting the environment, taking care of each other. Those kinds of things really, really have a dramatic impact in shaping the hippies, who shape those kind of ideals that are sort of part of this broad movement, social movements in the States with the, as I said earlier, the Vietnam protest, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, gay rights movement. All these movements, social movements, really begin to gain momentum in the 60s, all kind of colored by these ideas. So many joined movements concerning the environment, Aboriginal rights in Canada, and of course Native Americans. So in Canada we refer to First Peoples as First Nations. In the United States they use the term Native Americans. Aboriginal rights or Indigenous rights, Vietnam civil rights and gay rights, as I said before. The music of Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, here they are, the Who, mirrored many of the sort of baby boomer values at the time. You know, and I teach actually a history of rock and roll, which is a wonderful course to teach, and have the opportunity to expose young people to all this great music. You know, there's a reason, I think, that when you listen to the music, particularly of the late 1960s, why it was so powerful and so resonant, because those generations of songwriters and artists had a lot to talk about, a lot of things to reflect on. There's a lot of things going on in the United States at the time that gave these young artists fuel for their creativity. So When you look at someone like Jimi Hendrix or the Jefferson Airplane or Creedence Clearwater Revival from San Francisco, man, wonderful music. Incredible burst of creativity in the United States from 1964 to 1969, so quite remarkable. Political leaders had to recognize the power of this movement and would reduce the voting age to 18, and the drinking age was lowered to offset the appeal of illicit drugs. The older generations had to kind of come to terms with the fact that this was a huge voting bloc at the time. So I think a lot of them really had to kind of say, we need to somehow find a way of mobilizing this generation, or because they are now shaping politics. Protest groups like Greenpeace and feminism would form pressure groups, which kind of evolves out of this culture at the time. So, as the hippies turned into yuppies, and by the 1980s, no one could have imagined that the fruits of the economic boom from 45 to 70 would face challenges. Much like the boom of the 1920s, nobody thought in 1925 that incredible boom would lead to the Great Depression. Now, while we didn't have a depression in the 1970s, we do see a significant shift in the growth of our economy in Canada. A variety of factors caused the new crisis, but the 1973 oil embargo imposed by OPEC triggered it, that the West was not getting the oil that we needed, so there were huge lineups at gas stations, the price of oil went up. I remember this here in Victoria, row upon row upon row of cars waiting to get gas, and so it was a huge crisis. Prices of all manufactured goods rose and people struggled, triggering worker demands for pay raises, which further increased prices of goods. Inflation was spiraling out of control. So, the businesses are saying if workers want to get paid more, and rightfully they should, then the products they produce are going to have to go up. So this is the unfortunate byproduct of higher wages. It's higher the price of higher consumer goods increase in price. By the late 1970s, there was a need for dual income families, and many more mothers enter the workforce. So that's where we see a shift. By the late 1970s, early 80s, it's becoming increasingly difficult for having a one-income earner in the family. Now mom needs to go to work, and we see parents forced to put maybe their kids in daycares as well. So it's becoming a real challenge for many families at the time. By 1978, family buying power had dropped for the first time since the end of World War II. Isn't that something? That's quite a statistic. The first time since the end of World War II that families' power had dropped. So there's a shift. Along with economic challenges, you're seeing an increased regional disparity. So the economic gap between the poor and more prosperous regions of Canada became a central issue. Resource-rich provinces, maybe like BC, where we have timber, we have fish, which can be exported overseas. We may have more markets than prairie wheat, or than maritime lobsters, or maritime fisheries, or so forth. So, how wealthy a province is going to be dependent on how much is being produced and sold, and so forth. The Atlantic fishing industry and forestry, mining and fishing industries in BC saw massive layoffs. Since Ontario and Quebec did not suffer as much, it created resentments from the coastal areas. In the West, Western alienation would result, a sense that Ottawa's policies favored central Canada at the expense of the West. Trudeau would increase transfer payments to be used for social services in troubled areas like BC and Atlantic provinces. So there was an attempt by the Trudeau administration to equalize that balance, if you will. To deal with a renewed oil crisis and rising gas prices, the Liberals brought in the National Energy Program with goals to reduce oil consumption, protect Canadians from rising prices, and to make Canada self-sufficient in oil. And that's another huge question. Of course, Alberta produces more than enough oil for the Canadian market, so many say, why don't we just opt out of world oil and focus on our own? It's more complicated than that, though. I don't want to simplify a complex issue, but that's the kind of thing that I think people say about that. So, by 1984, oil prices fell and the NEP was abandoned, the National Energy Program. So, regionalism. Moves to protect Canadians were proving expensive, and the government was operating a deficit, spending more than money was taking in. That was always a very dangerous place to be, where that the amount you spend on the services and on infrastructure and everything else exceeds the money that is coming in from taxation. And eventually what's going to happen is the consumer, or the taxpayer, if you will, has to foot the bill. So that's when taxes go up, when the government's spending more than it's taking in. The growing social safety net required the federal government to borrow money to pay for its programs, and by the time Trudeau left office in '84, the federal government was almost $160 billion in debt. Yikes. In '84, the new conservative leader took the same philosophy as Ronald Reagan in the US and Thatcher in the UK, cut back the role of government in the economy by slashing social programs and give big corporations tax breaks so they reinvest in the economy, and as a result create new jobs for everyone. And some would say this is the birth of a type of ideology called neoliberalism. Leave everything in the hands of the market. The government needs to pull back its spending, give tax breaks to the rich so that they can create more jobs, and leave the private sector to heal the economy. That maybe the government just needs to get its foot out of the door in order to allow the markets to fix the economy. Very wishful thinking, but oftentimes oversimplified, pardon me. So Mulroney would trim social programs, stimulate the economy by cutting taxes, and the FTA with the US would cause businesses to thrive and people would be employed. However, the shift toward corporate and private responsibility for healing the economy failed as well. And in 1993, the Conservatives suffered a sweeping loss when only 2 Conservatives won seats in the federal election. So the idea of healing the economy by putting it in the hands of private interests didn't work either. So too much government spending, too little government spending. Where's the balance, right? How do you find that difference? Jean Chrétien, here he is here, and the Liberals would inherit a $466 billion national debt left behind by the outgoing Conservatives. Look at that debt. That's quite something. Chrétien injected money into the economy by creating jobs, and workers would spend their earnings and boost the economy. Finance Minister Paul Martin realized that Canada could no longer sustain big government. The Liberals cut $25.3 billion in spending, and in the first 3 years, as a result, 40,000 government jobs were lost. I mean, no matter how you slice and dice it, someone's going to lose because these bills have to be paid. So it's very, very difficult. Payments to provinces for post-secondary education, healthcare, and welfare were substantially cut, in addition to subsidies to businesses being removed. The plan was working, but Canadians paid a high price. Universities had to raise prices, and healthcare suffered as the federal government cut transfer payments to provinces. So all these were methods of trying to reduce the national debt. Technology, and in particular the advance of personal computers, would create new opportunities and change the landscape of business and communications by the beginning of the 20th century. So, of course, while this lecture ends technically at the year 2000, the changes that have occurred in the last 20 years are quite remarkable. Another time down the road, I'll look at Canada from the early part of the 21st century. But for our purposes, we are stopping at the end of the 20th century. All right, so that being said, we're going to leave it at that. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you again next time. Take care.